The wind carried a promise he couldn't keep, and the dust settled on everything like a fine layer of regret. "Please come with me. My twins need a mother like you." The words, spoken low and rough, cut through the oppressive silence of the platform. They were an anchor in the swirling eddy of humiliation that surrounded the woman in the plain gray dress. She stood beside a single, scuffed trunk, a solitary island against which the waves of public judgment crashed and receded. The train that had brought her here, full of hope fragile as spun glass, had already hissed its departure, its smoke a bitter smudge against the vast, indifferent blue of the Wyoming sky. It left behind only the lingering scent of coal and the stark reality of her abandonment. Alara didn't look at the man who spoke. Her gaze was fixed on a loose board in the platform, tracing its grain as if it held the answers to a future that had just been violently erased. The man who was to be her husband, a Mr. Alistair Sterling, had taken one look at her as she stepped from the carriage, at her tired eyes, her work-worn hands, the severe line of her hair pulled back from a face he deemed too plain for his prosperity, and had simply shaken his head. A quiet, final negation. He had pressed a few coins into her hand, a paltry sum for her passage and her shame, and turned his back, leaving her to the curious, pitiless stares of the townspeople of Promise Creek. Now this other man stood a few feet away. She had been vaguely aware of him before, a tall, broad-shouldered figure leaning against a support post, two small children half hidden in the folds of his worn canvas coat. He had the stillness of a man accustomed to waiting, his face weathered by sun and hardship, his eyes the color of a winter sky. She could feel the weight of his stare, but it was different from the others. It held no mockery, no satisfaction in her ruin. It held something else, something she couldn't name. A quiet assessment, a shared sorrow. She finally lifted her head, her chin held high not from pride, but from the sheer force of will it took not to collapse. Her eyes met his. He didn't flinch. He just held her gaze, his expression unreadable but steady. The two children, a boy and a girl with identical shocks of straw-colored hair and solemn, watchful eyes, peeked out from behind his legs. They looked to be no more than 5 years old. They stared at her with an unnerving intensity, their small faces mirroring their father's gravity. "I have nothing," she said, her voice a dry whisper, scraped raw by unshed tears. It was an admission of fact, not a plea for pity. The man nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "I have a homestead, a roof. There's food on the table." He gestured with his chin toward the children. "They lost their mother a year past. I can't do it all. The work. Them." His confession was as stark and unadorned as her own. It wasn't a proposal of romance or passion. It was a transaction born of mutual desperation, laid bare on a dusty train platform under the hot, unforgiving sun. He was offering a solution, not a salvation. He was offering a life of labor in exchange for her disgrace. He was offering his children a woman's care, and offering her a place to disappear. The townspeople were still watching, their whispers a low hum like insects in the heat. They saw a stoic widower, Jedediah Colt, a man who kept to himself on his remote plot of land, making a strange and public offer to the mail-order bride Sterling had so callously rejected. They saw a scandal averted, or perhaps a new one beginning. Alara looked from the man's weathered face to the two small, serious children clutching his trousers. She saw their mended clothes, the faint smudges of dirt on their cheeks, the deep, lonely ache in their eyes that she recognized because she saw it reflected in every puddle and shop window she passed. They were motherless, and she, in that moment, was everything less. Her dignity was a tattered rag, her future a blank, terrifying expanse. The coins in her palm felt cold and useless. They would buy her a meal, perhaps a room for a night, and then what? Another town, another hope, another potential rejection. She looked back at the man, Jedediah. He hadn't moved. He simply waited, his patience as vast and unyielding as the plains that stretched out behind him. He was not offering her a husband's affection. He was offering her purpose. He was offering his children a mother. And in doing so, he was offering her a shield against the world that had just cast her out. It was a choice between a known hardship and an unknown abyss. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like the first she had taken in an hour, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A quiet surrender. An act of survival. Jedediah's shoulders seemed to relax by a fraction. He moved then, his actions deliberate and efficient. He bent down and lifted her trunk, settling its weight onto his shoulder as if it were nothing. He said no more, merely turned and began to walk toward a dusty wagon hitched to a pair of sturdy-looking mules at the edge of the street. The children, released from their vigil, scurried after him, glancing back at Alara with a mixture of fear and curiosity. For a moment, she remained frozen on the platform, the spot of her humiliation. The whispers of the townsfolk finally died away as they realized the spectacle was over. They began to drift back to their own lives. Their brief moment of drama concluded. Alara was alone again, but this time, there was a path leading away from the platform. It was a dusty, uncertain path, leading to a life she had not chosen with a man she did not know. But it was a path. She took another breath, straightened the bodice of her gray dress, and followed him. The sun beat down on her head, but for the first time that day, she felt not its cruelty, but its warmth. A hint that survival was not just an instinct, but perhaps a journey toward something that might one day feel like home. The ride to the homestead was a long, silent affair. Jedediah handled the mules with a practiced, gentle hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The wagon wheels groaned and creaked, a rhythmic complaint against the hard-packed earth. Alara sat on the bench beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her back ramrod straight. The two children, Samuel and Sarah, were tucked into the back of the wagon, their heads occasionally popping up to stare at her before ducking back down with whispered giggles. The landscape unrolled before them, a vast tapestry of browns and golds under the immense, pale sky. It was a beautiful country, but a hard one. The land was sparse, dotted with sagebrush and hardy grasses that clung tenaciously to the dry soil. In the distance, the sharp, blue-gray peaks of a mountain range sawed at the sky. There was a profound loneliness to it all, a sense of scale that made a person feel small and insignificant. Alara wondered if a person could ever feel at home here, or if the land simply tolerated your presence until it decided to reclaim you. Jedediah did not speak. He seemed a man carved from the same material as the landscape, weathered, quiet, and self-contained. His silence wasn't hostile. It was simply a part of him, as natural as the calloused skin of his hands on the reins. Alara, in turn, had no words to offer. Her own silence was a fragile shield, a defense she had erected around the raw wound of her rejection. To speak would be to risk it cracking, and she could not afford to fall apart. Not here. Not now. After what felt like hours, he finally turned the mules off the main track and onto a fainter path that wound its way toward a small cluster of cottonwood trees. Nestled within their meager shade was a cabin. It was a simple structure, built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney at one end and a wide, covered porch at the front. A barn stood a short distance away, its wood bleached gray by the sun, and a small corral held a single horse that lifted its head and nickered as they approached. It was stark, isolated. The only sounds were the wind rustling the leaves of the cottonwoods, the creak of the wagon, and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. This was his world, and now it was hers. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch and set the brake. Without a word, he climbed down, his movements economical and sure. He walked to the back of the wagon and lifted her trunk, carrying it onto the porch and setting it down gently by the front door. He then turned and lifted the children out, placing them on their feet. Samuel, the boy, immediately ran toward the barn. Sarah, the girl, lingered, her thumb finding its way into her mouth as she stared at Alara with wide, solemn eyes. "The house has 2 rooms," Jedediah said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was low, matter-of-fact. "The main room and a sleeping room. The children sleep on a pallet by the hearth. There's a cot in the corner of the sleeping room. It was Martha's, for her sewing. It's yours." He did not say, "my wife's room." He said, "the sleeping room." The distinction was clear. He was offering her a space, not a position. He was not replacing his wife. He was hiring help. The cot was a physical manifestation of her status. Separate, temporary, a guest in a house that was not her own. Alara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She slid off the wagon bench, her legs stiff from the long ride. She smoothed down her dress and walked onto the porch, her steps hesitant. The wood was worn smooth in places, testament to the comings and goings of a life she had no part in. Jedediah opened the door and stood aside, allowing her to enter first. The inside of the cabin was dark and cool after the bright glare of the sun. It was spare, but immaculately clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A sturdy wooden table with 2 benches stood in the center of the room. A few shelves on the wall held tin plates and cups, neatly stacked. In the far corner, a small cooking stove stood cold. Everything spoke of utility and solitude. But there were other touches, too. A faded, hand-stitched quilt was draped over a wooden rocking chair by the hearth. A child's crude drawing of a horse was tacked to the wall. These were the faint, lingering ghosts of a woman named Martha. Alara felt a sudden, sharp pang of intrusion, as if she were trespassing on sacred ground. "The well is out back," Jedediah said from the doorway. "Water needs fetching for the evening meal. The woodbox needs filling." He wasn't giving orders so much as stating the facts of their existence. This is what must be done to survive another day. Alara turned to face him. "I can cook," she said, the words feeling clumsy in her mouth. "And I can mend. I am a good worker." It was a promise, a reassurance, a plea for him not to regret his impulsive offer. He held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a short, sharp nod. "I'll see to the stock." He turned and walked away, his heavy boots thudding on the porch boards, leaving her alone in the quiet, shadowed cabin with the ghost of his wife and the silent, watchful little girl who stood in the doorway. Sarah had not moved. She just stood there, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes fixed on Alara. Alara's heart ached for the child. She knew that look. It was the look of a creature that has learned not to expect kindness, but to watch for threats. Slowly, Alara knelt down, making herself smaller, less imposing. She didn't smile. A false smile would be an insult to the child's intelligence. She simply waited. After a long minute, Sarah took her thumb out of her mouth. "Are you our new mother?" she asked, her voice small and clear as a bell. The question hung in the air, heavy and fragile. Alara thought of the cold coins in her pocket, the jeering faces at the station, the hard cot in the corner of the other room. She thought of the promise she had made to herself to simply survive. "I'm here to help your father," she said, her voice gentle but honest. "I'm here to help take care of you." It was the truth, and the truth was all she had to offer. Sarah seemed to consider this. She took a tentative step into the room, her eyes darting from Alara to the rocking chair and back again. She was gauging, measuring, deciding. Alara remained perfectly still, letting the child come to her. It was the beginning of a long, silent negotiation, the first step in building something new in a house haunted by what was lost. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the floor. The day was ending, and a new life, a life of work and silence, was about to begin. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Alara rose before dawn, the chill of the cabin floor seeping through the thin soles of her shoes. She would stir the embers in the hearth, add wood from the box Jedediah kept perpetually full, and set a pot of coffee to boil on the stove. The smell of it, rich and earthy, was often the first thing that broke the cabin's deep silence. Jedediah would enter from the barn as the first pale light touched the sky, smelling of hay and cold air. He would nod to her, a brief, sharp dip of his chin, and take the tin cup of coffee she offered. He drank it standing by the door, his gaze already on the fields, his mind on the endless list of chores that constituted his life. They rarely spoke in these early morning hours. Their communication was a series of gestures. The offered cup, the grateful nod, the quiet way she set a plate of biscuits and bacon on the table for him and the children. Alara learned the landscape of his life through observation. She learned the way he favored his left shoulder when he was tired, the deep lines of concentration that formed between his brows when he was mending a piece of harness, the way his hands, though calloused and rough, were surprisingly gentle with his children. He was a man of profound patience and relentless industry. He worked from sunup to sundown, wrestling a living from the unforgiving soil. Her domain was the cabin. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, mended the children's clothes with tiny, neat stitches, and coaxed a small, stubborn garden of greens and root vegetables to life in a patch of earth behind the house. She learned the quirks of the old stove, the way the wind moaned in the chimney when it came from the north, and the particular spots on the windows that collected the most dust. The work was hard, but it was honest. It filled her days and kept the despair at bay. There was a simple, clean satisfaction in seeing a neat stack of mended shirts or a row of freshly baked bread cooling on the counter. It was proof that she was earning her keep. The children were her silent shadows. Samuel, the boy, was as taciturn as his father. He would watch her for long stretches, his expression serious, as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. He was a whirlwind of energy outside, chasing chickens and mimicking his father's work, but inside the cabin, he was a quiet, watchful presence. Sarah was different. She was the emissary of the family's heart. She would bring Alara small treasures: a smooth, gray stone from the creek bed, a wildflower with a drooping head, a fallen bird's feather. She would lay these offerings on the table without a word and then watch Alara's face for a reaction. Alara always accepted them with a quiet, "Thank you," and would place the stone on the windowsill or the flower in a cup of water. Each small gift was a test, a question. "Are you safe? Can I trust you?" Trust did not come easily. The ghost of Martha was a constant, unspoken presence. Her rocking chair sat by the hearth, empty. No one used it. It was a shrine, a testament to a love and a life that had been abruptly cut short. Alara cleaned around it, dusted its smooth wooden arms, but she would never have dreamed of sitting in it. It was not her place. One afternoon, while sweeping the sleeping room, she found a small, locked wooden box at the bottom of the wardrobe. It was a simple thing, but she knew with absolute certainty that it had belonged to Martha. She felt a prickle of shame, as if she had stumbled upon a secret not meant for her, and quickly closed the wardrobe door. She was a caretaker of this house, but not of its memories. Jedediah maintained his distance. He was polite, even considerate in his own quiet way, but there was a wall around him, built of grief and solitude. He never spoke of his wife. He never spoke of the past. He spoke of the weather, the state of the fences, the need for more flour from town. Their conversations were transactions of information, necessary for the smooth operation of the homestead. Yet, small things began to shift almost imperceptibly. One evening, Alara was struggling to bring in a heavy bucket of water from the well. Her arms ached and her back protested. As she staggered toward the porch, Jedediah appeared from the barn. He didn't speak. He simply walked over, took the bucket from her hands, and carried it inside. He set it by the stove and then left, returning to his work. The act was so simple, so swift, but it left Alara breathless. It was the first time he had helped her with what was considered her work. It was a small crack in the wall of their separate duties. A few days later, she noticed the axe by the woodpile had been sharpened to a razor's edge. She hadn't asked him to do it. He had just seen the need and met it. Then, one morning, she came outside to find a new, sturdy leather sole neatly stitched onto one of her worn-out shoes, which she had left by the door. The stitches were rough but strong. His work, done in secret while she slept. These quiet acts of service were his language. He could not offer words of comfort or companionship, but he could offer a sharp axe, a mended shoe, a heavy bucket carried. Alara began to understand that this was his way of showing, not kindness perhaps, but respect. Acknowledgement. He saw her labor and he valued it. A storm was brewing in the west. For days, the clouds had been gathering over the mountains, great bruised purple masses that promised a reckoning. The air grew heavy and still, charged with an electric tension. The birds fell silent. Jedediah worked with a feverish intensity, securing the barn door, checking the roof of the cabin, bringing the horse and mules into their stalls. He was preparing for a siege. That evening, as the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, against the window panes, Sarah began to cough. It was a small, dry sound at first, but as the evening wore on, it deepened into a rattling sickness that shook her small frame. By the time Alara tucked her into her pallet by the fire, her forehead was burning with fever. The storm had arrived, both outside and in. Alara looked at Jedediah across the flickering lamplight, a silent question in her eyes. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw the wall around him crumble, replaced by the raw, naked fear of a father terrified of losing everything all over again. The storm broke with a fury that seemed bent on tearing their small world apart. Wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a mournful, shrieking sound that rattled the shutters and sent puffs of smoke billowing from the hearth. Rain lashed against the log walls in solid sheets, a relentless drumming that vibrated through the floorboards. Each flash of lightning bleached the room in a stark, ghostly white, followed a heartbeat later by a crack of thunder so loud it felt as if the mountains themselves were splitting open. Inside, a different storm raged. Sarah's fever climbed, her small body trembling with chills despite the heat radiating from her skin. Her breaths came in shallow, rasping gasps, and she tossed fitfully on her pallet, lost in a fevered dream. Samuel sat huddled on a bench, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear he was too young to understand but too old not to feel. He watched his sister, then his father, then Alara, his gaze a silent plea for an assurance no one could give. Jedediah was a man undone. The stoic control he wore like a second skin had been stripped away, leaving only a raw, desperate paternal terror. He paced the length of the small room, his heavy boots echoing the thunder outside. He would stop by the hearth, stare down at his daughter, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, his face a mask of helpless anguish. He looked trapped, a powerful animal caught in a snare it could not see or fight. He had faced down blizzards, droughts, and the back-breaking labor of the land. But this, the fragility of his own child, was a force that rendered him powerless. Alara moved with a quiet, focused calm. The chaos outside and the fear inside seemed to sharpen her senses, lending her a clarity she didn't know she possessed. All the humiliation and sorrow of her own past fell away, burned off by the urgent heat of the child's fever. Sarah was all that mattered. "We need to bring the fever down," she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through Jedediah's frantic pacing. He stopped and looked at her, his eyes wild. For the first time, he seemed to truly see her not as a hired helper or a solution to a problem, but as an ally. She went to the sleeping room and returned with a basin and a clean linen cloth. "The well water will be too cold," she said, thinking aloud. "We need it cool, not a shock." She ladled water from the bucket by the stove, testing it with her fingers until it was just right. She knelt beside Sarah's pallet. The child's skin was dry and hot to the touch. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice a low murmur. "It's all right. I'm here." She dipped the cloth into the cool water, wrung it out, and gently began to bathe the child's face and neck. Sarah whimpered, her eyelids fluttering, but she didn't pull away. Jedediah watched, frozen for a moment. Then he seemed to break free of his paralysis. He moved to the other side of the pallet and knelt down. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Talk to her," Alara said without looking up from her task. "Let her hear your voice." He reached out a large, trembling hand and stroked Sarah's sweat-dampened hair back from her forehead. "Sarah girl," he began, his voice thick. "Daddy's here. You just rest now. You just fight this thing." He continued to speak to her in a low, rambling monologue, telling her about the horse, about the coming spring, about anything and everything that came to mind. His words were a steady, rumbling counterpoint to the howling wind. They worked together through the long, dark hours, a silent practice team. When the cloth grew warm, he would take it, rinse it in the basin she held, and hand it back. When Sarah coughed, a racking, painful sound, he would gather her into his arms, holding her upright against his broad chest while Alara supported her head. In those moments, their hands would brush, their shoulders would touch. The carefully constructed space they had maintained between them for weeks dissolved in the face of their shared purpose, their shared fear. Alara remembered her mother using willow bark for fevers. "Is there any willow by the creek?" she asked. He nodded. "A small grove, down past the bend. We need the bark. A tea." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. He pulled on his heavy coat, the one that always hung by the door, a symbol of his solitary patrols of his land. He grabbed a lantern and a hatchet and, without a word of hesitation, plunged out into the raging storm. Alara watched the small bubble of lantern light disappear into the tumultuous dark, her heart seized with a new kind of fear. He was gone for what felt like an eternity. She tended to Sarah, her movements automatic, her ears straining for the sound of his return over the roar of the storm. She fed the fire, spoke soothingly to a terrified Samuel, and continued to bathe Sarah's feverish skin. She was alone, but for the first time in that house, she did not feel like an outsider. She felt like its defender. Finally, the door burst open and he stumbled in, soaked to the bone and gasping for breath, but clutching a handful of pale, wet willow bark. He didn't seem to notice the cold or the water streaming from his clothes. His eyes went straight to Sarah. "Any change?" he asked, his voice ragged. "She's resting," Alara said. It was the best she could offer. She took the bark and set it to simmer in a small pot of water over the fire. As the tea steeped, filling the small cabin with its bitter, medicinal scent, a fragile quiet settled between them. The worst of the storm seemed to be passing, its fury abating to a steady, drumming rain. Jedediah slumped onto a bench, his exhaustion palpable. He scrubbed a hand over his face, his defenses completely gone. "Martha, she got a fever," he said, his voice barely a whisper, directed at the floorboards. "Came on fast. Like this." The doctor was a day's ride away. By the time he got here, he trailed off, the words choked by a grief a year old but still raw as an open wound. Alara stopped what she was doing. She looked at him, at this strong, silent man so utterly broken by memory. She understood then. His silence wasn't a rejection of her. It was a fortress he had built around his pain. His fear for Sarah was tangled up in the horror of his failure to save his wife. She said nothing. There were no words that could soothe such a wound. Instead, she poured the cooled willow bark tea into a cup, knelt beside him, and held it out. He looked up, his eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it made her own throat tighten. He took the cup, their fingers brushing for a second longer than necessary. In that small touch, in the shared space of that desperate night, the foundation of their arrangement shifted. It was no longer a contract of convenience. It was a partnership, forged in fear and sealed in the quiet, shared hope for the dawn. The fever broke just as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, painting the rain-streaked glass in shades of pearl and lavender. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and smelling of wet earth. Sarah's breathing eased, the rasping sound replaced by a deep, even rhythm. The fire in her skin had cooled to a natural warmth. She was sleeping, truly sleeping, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion settled over the cabin. Jedediah had not moved from his daughter's side. His large frame slumped in a chair he'd pulled close to the hearth. He had fallen into a light, uneasy doze, his head resting against the rough stone of the chimney, one hand still loosely holding Sarah's. Samuel, having finally succumbed to his own weariness, was curled up at the end of his father's bench, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. Alara moved about the room, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. She added a log to the fire, tidied the clutter of the long night, and put a pot of coffee on to brew. The familiar domestic actions were a comfort, a way of stitching the world back together after it had been torn apart. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer a space of awkward distance, but a shared stillness, heavy with the weight of what they had endured together. As the sun rose higher, casting a warm, golden light into the room, Jedediah stirred. He blinked, disoriented, and his first instinct was to look at Sarah. Seeing her peaceful sleep, the tension visibly drained from his body, leaving him slumped and weary. His eyes then found Alara. He didn't speak, but his gaze held a depth of gratitude and respect that words could never have conveyed. She brought him a cup of coffee. He took it, his hands cupping the warm tin as if to draw strength from it. They sat in the quiet for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the gentle breathing of the sleeping children. "I was a mail-order bride once before," Alara said softly, her voice barely disturbing the quiet. She was looking into the fire, not at him. The confession seemed to rise from a place deep inside her, unlocked by the intimacy of the night's ordeal. To a farmer in Ohio, he had 2 sons. His wife had died in childbirth. Jedediah remained silent, listening. His stillness was an invitation for her to continue. "He was a good man, stern but fair. We were married for 3 years. I was content. I loved his boys as if they were my own." She paused, her fingers tracing a knot in the wooden table. "Then the influenza came, took all 3 of them in a week. The farm was sold to pay his debts. His family told me to go back where I came from. I had nothing. I was nothing to them." She finally looked at him, her eyes clear and devoid of self-pity. "When Mr. Sterling sent for me, I thought it was a second chance. A chance to have a family again. He said in his letters he wanted a sensible and plain woman to run his home. I thought I was what he wanted." She gave a small, bitter shrug. "I suppose I was too plain, even for that." Her story hung in the air between them, a stark and lonely tale. It explained the guardedness in her eyes, the quiet dignity that was her only armor. She was not just a rejected bride. She was a widow, a mother who had lost her children, a woman twice cast out by fate. Jedediah stared into his coffee cup. The new knowledge settled heavily upon him. He had seen her as a solution to his problems, a pair of hands to help with the work and the children. He had not considered the depth of her own losses, the ghost she carried with her. He had offered her shelter from a storm, not realizing she had already survived a hurricane. He cleared his throat. "Martha," he said, the name sounding rusty from disuse. "She planted the garden you're tending." She said the soil was stubborn but honest. Just like her, he managed a faint, sad smile. "She would have liked you. You're a fighter." It was the most he had ever spoken of his wife, and the most personal thing he had ever said to Alara. It was a bridge built across the chasm of their griefs. He was acknowledging her strength, and in doing so, he was sharing the memory of his wife with her, not as a barrier, but as a piece of his own story. He gestured with his chin toward the rocking chair, its empty space by the fire more prominent than ever. "That was her chair," he said. "She rocked the babies in it. Both of them. She loved this place. Saw a future here." Alara looked at the chair. It was no longer just a shrine to a ghost. It was a symbol of a woman's love, a mother's hopes. It was a part of the history of this home, a history that she was now, inexplicably, a part of. She didn't move toward it, not yet. But the invisible wall around it had dissolved. It was just a chair now, waiting. Later that day, after Sarah had woken, weak but clear-eyed, and had taken a few sips of broth, Alara found herself alone in the main room. Jedediah had taken Samuel out to check for damage from the storm. The children's pallet was neatly rolled up. The cabin was clean and quiet. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She walked over to the rocking chair. She ran her hand over the smooth, worn wood of its arm. She thought of Martha, a woman she would never know, who had sat here and dreamed of a future for her children. She thought of her own lost boys, of the life that had been stolen from her. and she thought of the long, terrifying night, and the man who had faced the storm for a stranger, and the child who was now sleeping safely because of them. Slowly, tentatively, she sat down. The chair was a perfect fit. She pushed off gently with her foot, and the chair began to rock, a slow, rhythmic, creaking sound. It was the sound of a heartbeat, the sound of a home. It was a sound of continuance. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since she had stepped off that train, Alara felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to heal. Weeks turned into a month, then two. The harshness of summer softened into the golden light of early autumn. A comfortable, quiet domesticity settled over the cabin, as gentle and inevitable as the changing leaves on the cottonwoods. The routines remained. The early mornings, the hard work, the shared, simple meals. But they were no longer underscored by tension and uncertainty. The silence between Jedediah and Alara was now a language of its own, a shared space of understanding that needed no words. Alara had claimed the rocking chair as her own. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, she would sit by the fire with her mending, the gentle creak of the runners a soothing rhythm in the quiet house. Jedediah would sit at the table, oiling a piece of leather or carving a small wooden animal for one of the children, the scrape of his knife a soft counterpoint. They rarely spoke, but they were together. The ghosts of the past had not vanished, but they had receded, making room for the living. The children had blossomed under her care. Samuel's solemn watchfulness had given way to a boyish confidence. He would follow Alara in the garden, asking questions about the plants, his brow furrowed in concentration just like his father's. Sarah, fully recovered from her illness, was her constant companion, a cheerful, chattering presence who filled the cabin with a lightness it hadn't known in a year. She called Alara Lara, a name that was hers alone. She had stopped asking if Alara was her new mother. She simply acted as if she was. One afternoon, Sarah presented Alara with a new treasure. It was a piece of paper, a page torn from an old ledger, covered in a child's drawing. It showed for stick figures, too large and too small, standing in front of a boxy cabin with a crooked chimney puffing out smoke. The figures were holding hands. Sarah pointed to each one in turn. Daddy. Some. Me. Lara, a family. Alara felt a surge of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. She wordlessly tacked the drawing to the wall, next to the faded drawing of the horse that had been there when she arrived. The two pictures, old and new, hung side by side. But their peaceful isolation could not last forever. The pantry was running low on staples, flour, salt, sugar. A trip to Promise Creek was unavoidable. The prospect filled Alara with a cold dread. The town was the site of her deepest humiliation, a place where she was known only as the woman Alistair Sterling had rejected. Jedediah seemed to sense her apprehension. "We'll go together," he said one evening, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The children need new shoes for the winter. We'll make a day of it." The morning of the trip, Alara dressed with care in her best gray dress, the one she had arrived in. It was mended and clean, but it felt like a costume from another life. As she braided her hair, she saw her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. The woman looking back was still plain, her face still etched with sorrow, but there was a new strength in her eyes, a quiet resilience that had not been there before. The journey to town was different this time. Alara no longer felt like a piece of cargo. She sat on the wagon bench beside Jedediah, Sarah nestled between them, and Samuel riding in the back, chattering excitedly. The world felt brighter, the sky a more hopeful shade of blue. Promise Creek, however, was just as she remembered it, dusty, busy, and filled with watchful eyes. As they walked down the main street toward the Mercantile, Alara felt the familiar stares. Whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. She kept her head high, her gaze fixed straight ahead, but she could feel the color rising in her cheeks. Inside the Mercantile, the air was thick with the scent of coffee beans, leather, and dried apples. It was crowded. As Jedediah was negotiating with the shopkeeper for a sack of flour, a voice, smooth and condescending, cut through the low hum of conversation. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in." Alara froze. She knew that voice. She turned slowly. Alistair Sterling stood a few feet away, leaning against a counter. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, a gold watch chain gleaming on his vest. He was handsome in a polished, self-satisfied way. He looked her up and down, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "I see you found a situation more suited to your rustic charms," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Colt's charity case, I hear. Taking in strays now, are we, Jedediah?" The store fell silent. Everyone turned to watch. It was the spectacle from the train platform, played out once again for their entertainment. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over Alara. She felt herself shrink, the strength she had nurtured over the past months threatening to evaporate under the heat of his scorn. She wanted to run, to disappear. Jedediah finished his transaction, his movements unhurried. He turned from the counter, his face calm, but Alara saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. He looked at Sterling, his winter sky eyes cold and hard as chips of ice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply moved to stand beside Alara. He did something he had never done before. He reached out and placed his hand gently on her arm. A simple, proprietary gesture that spoke volumes. The warmth of his touch seeped through the thin fabric of her dress, a steadying anchor in the sea of shame. He looked directly at Sterling, his voice low and clear, but carrying to every corner of the silent store. "This is my wife," he said. The words, plain and direct, landed with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Sterling's smirk faltered, his face clouding with disbelief and fury. Jedediah wasn't finished. His grip on Alara's arm tightened slightly, a gesture of reassurance. "Her name is Mrs. Colt, and you will show her the respect she is due." It was not a request. It was a command. It was a moral declaration, a line drawn in the dust of the mercantile floor. He had publicly claimed her, not as his charity case, not as his housekeeper, but as his own. He had wrapped her in his name, using it as a shield to protect her from the very man who had tried to strip her of all dignity. Sterling, flustered and outmaneuvered, could only stammer, his face turning a blotchy red. He had intended to humiliate her, but Jedediah had turned the tables, humiliating him instead. The townspeople were no longer looking at Alara with pity or scorn. They were looking at Jedediah Colt with a newfound respect, and at the woman beside him with a dawning understanding. Jedediah held Sterling's gaze for a moment longer, then dismissed him with a slight narrowing of his eyes. He turned to Alara. "Let's get the children their shoes," he said, his voice back to its normal, quiet tone, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. He led her toward the back of the store, his hand still resting on her arm. She walked beside him, her head held high, the whispers that followed them now a murmur of shock and admiration. In that moment, standing beside this quiet, steadfast man, shielded by his strength, Alara was no longer the rejected bride. She was Mrs. Colt. She was home. The ride back to the homestead was the quietest journey they had ever taken. The late afternoon sun slanted across the plains, painting the landscape in long, soft shadows. The children, exhausted by the excitement of the town and content with their new shoes, dozed in the back of the wagon. On the bench, Jedediah and Alara sat side by side, a mere hand's breadth apart, enveloped in a silence that was more profound and articulate than any conversation. The words he had spoken in the mercantile, "This is my wife," hung in the air between them, shimmering with unspoken meaning. It had been a lie, a beautiful, protective lie, born of necessity and a fierce, surprising loyalty. But as the wagon wheels turned, carrying them farther from the judgment of the town and deeper into the solitude of their shared life, the lie began to feel like a prophecy. It had the weight and substance of truth. Alara kept her eyes on the horizon, but she was acutely aware of the man beside her. She could feel the steady warmth of his presence, see the sure, capable way his hands held the reins. He had stood for her. He had defended her honor when she thought she had none left. He had given her his name, a shield against the world's cruelty. It was the greatest gift she had ever received. When they finally arrived back at the cabin, the sun was setting, bleeding purple and orange across the sky. The familiar shapes of the barn and the cottonwood trees were a welcome sight. This small, isolated patch of land was no longer just a refuge. It was a sanctuary they had built together, one silent day at a time. Jedediah carried the sleeping children inside and laid them on their pallets. Elara began to put away the supplies, her movements fluid and practiced. They moved around the small space in their usual, comfortable rhythm, but everything had changed. The foundation had shifted. The unspoken agreement between them had been rewritten in public, for all to see. After a simple supper of bread and cheese, Jedediah went outside to see to the stock. Elara was left alone in the cabin, the firelight dancing on the walls. She looked at the children's drawing, the 4 stick figures holding hands. Mrs. Colt, the name echoed in her mind, felt strange and foreign, yet also deeply, fundamentally right. She walked to the sleeping room and opened the bottom of the wardrobe. The small, locked wooden box that had belonged to Martha was still there. For months, she had respected its privacy, seeing it as a part of the past she had no right to. Now she felt a gentle pull toward it. She lifted it out. It was light. She ran her fingers over the smooth, dark wood. She did not try to open it. Instead, she carried it out to the main room and placed it on the mantelpiece, above the fire. It was not a secret to be hidden away in the dark. It was a memory, a part of the history of this family, and it deserved a place of honor. When Jedediah came back inside, he stopped in the doorway, his gaze falling on the box. He looked at it for a long moment, then his eyes met Elara's. She saw no anger or resentment in his face, only a quiet understanding. He nodded slowly, accepting her gesture for what it was, an act of respect, an integration of the past into their present. That night, for the first time, Elara did not feel like a guest sleeping on a temporary cot. She felt the solidness of the cabin around her, the protective embrace of the home they were forging. The lie Jedediah had told had planted a seed of possibility. Now, in the quiet dark, it was beginning to take root. They were not husband and wife, not yet. But they were partners. They were a family. The laughter of the children, the shared labor of their days, the protective circle he had drawn around her. These were the things from which a life was built. The creak of the floorboards as he moved about the main room was a comforting sound. She was no longer alone. They were building a home, not from romance or passion, but from something far more durable: mutual respect, shared hardship, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. The seasons turned, cycling through the land's ancient, unhurried rhythm. Autumn's gold gave way to the stark, white silence of winter. Snow blanketed the plains, muffling the world in a thick, quiet peace. The cabin became their entire universe, a small bubble of warmth and light against the vast, frozen landscape. The hardships of winter forged them closer still. They worked together to keep the paths clear, the livestock fed, and the fire roaring. The children's laughter was a bright, cheerful sound that filled the short days and long, dark nights. The lie told in the mercantile was never spoken of again. It existed between them, a settled fact that had reshaped their reality. When the circuit preacher made his biannual visit in the early spring, stopping at the homestead for a night, no one questioned it when he recorded their names in his log as Mr. and Mrs. Jedediah Colt. They stood side by side as he said a blessing over their home, and the quiet ceremony felt more real and binding than any formal wedding. The lie had become the truth simply by being lived. Spring arrived with a tentative green blush on the land. The creek swelled with melted snow, and the cottonwoods budded. Elara's garden, which she had carefully covered and protected through the winter, began to thrive. Life was returning to the world, and to the small home nestled within it. The warmth that had grown from their shared silence was now a palpable thing. It was in the way Jedediah would watch her from the porch as she worked in the garden, a small, quiet smile touching his lips. It was in the way she would save him the last biscuit from supper, placing it by his plate without a word. It was in the easy way the children moved between them, seeking a hug from him, a story from her, their love an anchor for them both. From silence came warmth. From hardship came strength. From two broken pasts, they were building a single, solid future. The rocking chair by the fire was no longer a memorial to what was lost, but a testament to what had been found. Its steady, creaking rhythm was the heartbeat of their home, a sound of peace, of comfort, of belonging. Jedediah's guilt had been eased by the daily act of caring for this new family, and Alara's sorrow had been soothed by the stability and safety she had found in his steadfast presence. They had healed each other, not with grand pronouncements, but with the simple, repetitive acts of a shared life. One cool evening in late spring, Jedediah came in from the barn after a long day of plowing. The air was sweet with the smell of rain and freshly turned earth. He was tired, his shoulders slumped, but it was the good, honest weariness of a man providing for his own. He stopped at the wash basin on the porch to clean his hands, the splashing of the water a familiar, comforting sound. He entered the cabin and hung his heavy canvas coat on the hook by the door. The coat, once a symbol of his lonely isolation, now simply looked like what it was: the working coat of a family man, home for the night. Alara was sitting in the rocking chair by the hearth, the firelight casting a warm glow on her face as she mended a small tear in Samuel's shirt. The children were asleep on their pallets, their faces peaceful in the flickering light. He didn't speak. He walked over to the fireplace and stood for a moment, warming his hands. He looked at the children, at the drawing they had made, at the small wooden box on the mantel, at this woman who had so quietly and completely rebuilt his world. He pulled up a small stool and sat down near her, stretching his legs out toward the fire. The silence between them was full and comfortable, rich with unspoken history. He was a man of few words, and she was a woman who had learned to understand the language of his actions. After a few moments, she set aside her mending in her lap. She reached out and placed her hand gently over his, her touch light but sure. His hand was rough and calloused from his work, but it was warm and strong beneath hers. He turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers, their hands resting together on his knee. He didn't need to ask. He didn't need to say a word. Her touch was the answer to a question he had been afraid to voice for months. It was a confirmation, a promise, a final, quiet acceptance. The wind could carry whatever promises it wished, for they had made their own, here in the heart of their home. She stayed.